Content warning: graphic infection and body horror, vivid descriptions of worms and disembowelment, death of staff members, cremation, and traumatic scenes. If that's likely to be upsetting, please take care. I worked in the basement of what looked from the outside like an abandoned hospital wing. People called it a hole in the ground with a hum, a maintenance elevator that still answered sometimes, fluorescent bulbs that buzzed like drowned bees, faded signage that said no public access, and a permanent dust ring on the stair rail where nobody had touched it in years. To the rare passerby, it looked derelict. To the Imperium, it was useful. To the patients who ended up below it, and to the handful of us who ran the clinic, it was everything. We didn't advertise. The specialty clinic beneath that forgotten wing existed because reality required people in the shadows to keep being people. Phase species don't always go to public hospitals. We had agreements, rules, and a stack of bureaucratic reasons why secrecy stayed profitable for everyone involved. The administrator liked it that way. The Imperium liked it that way. We liked it mostly because it let us do our work without headlines. So let me get one thing out straight away. Yes, the basement felt abandoned. The elevator smelled of old copper and disinfectant. The corridor outside Ward 5 had a moth-eaten upholstery chair that never saw visitors. The lights were too bright and the place too quiet when nothing was happening. That quiet gets into your bones. It makes you notice the smell of an IV line, the whisper of latex, the way a patient's breathing changes when they believe no one is listening. We had 5 rules, and we repeated them like prayers because there were too many things that could go wrong otherwise. 1. Everyone gets assigned a room and they stay in it unless escorted. 2. A guard is posted at every major door, not for show but to make sure filings and bodies and bad intentions don't move where they shouldn't. 3. If anybody grows aggressive, you call security and you do not try to be a hero. Let protocol handle it. 4. Wards are separated by species in need. Mixing them was how we learned to be very careful. 5. Secrecy. You do not talk about what happens down here. The rules read sterile on paper, but they were our scaffolding when the lights flickered and breath came fast. If you want every terrifying detail, stay with me. I'll walk you through it, slowly, because I remember things in pieces, and some of them feel like they belong to someone else. Some of them I think about at night and wake up halfway out of bed, convinced I can hear the creak of the basement doors. That sound is the worst. My name's Jamie. Everyone called me Curry because someone thought it was funny that I'd always bring ridiculous food into the staff fridge, as if smells could anchor us to something normal.
I ran triage and did the early stabilization because triage is a place where you see the truth of a patient and it keeps you useful. Dr. Sylvia Meehan ran the clinic, precise, stubborn, and the kind of person who would cut off her own hand if the situation demanded it. Samara and Sasha were nurses. Samara laughed too loud to be inside a basement clinic, and Sasha kept an old photograph of her kid taped to the inside of her locker. Dr. Leroy floated between us, good with difficult presentations, a little too fond of late-night cigarettes off shift. Julian and Croft were our porters and supply eyes. Barrett handled records. You learn people quickly when your shifts end at 3 in the morning and the only other light is a red exit sign. We had a roster of species who came in for things standard clinics tended to fumble. Vampires. Not all of them lived in the Gothic novels. Most preferred the dimmer rooms and polite charts. Gorgons needed eyewear and oddly specific surgical towels. Kara and Mal patients had very different social contacts. Werewolves came in for the usual things, and, when sober enough, for the things that made their lives manageable. The Imperium let us have walls so we could treat people without public freakouts or legislative nightmares. It also meant we carried an official list of things nobody else knew to expect. Artie Locke was the kind of patient you learn by sight. He'd come in before for alcohol detox, stitches, sleep disturbance, maybe a broken hand from a bar fight or a fistful of apologies. He wasn't glamorous. He had hair that never lay the same direction twice, a tattoo with a name half-faded on his forearm, and a smile that worked when he wasn't in pain. He was a werewolf in the terms of bureaucracy, a species classification on a chart, and a body that could go from human to something else when triggers stacked. We'd seen Artie before. You'd find him passed out under a towel in recovery, or sober enough to answer a question and tell a joke. He talked about a dog he once had. He liked cheap whiskey. The night he came in, the maintenance elevator stuck on one floor, and the corridor smelled of old coffee and something chemical. It was just after midnight by the flicker of the wall clock. We'd finished rounds, and half the team had tried to get sleep. Julian brought him in on a stretcher. Not dramatic, just a man who had finally gotten himself to the door. The first impression, pale, clammy, eyes too bright in their sockets, and he smelled like iron and vomit and stale smoke. Acute abdominal pain, Julian said, and set the stretcher down in the triage bay. I put my hand on his wrist for a pulse while Barrett grabbed the chart. He was tachycardic and hypotensive. Basically, his heart was racing and his blood pressure was low, like his body couldn't keep up. He'd lost a lot of fluid. His abdomen felt tight when I palpated it. He was breathing in short bursts. There was already blood in the vomit bucket.
The sort of blood that gives you a hollow feeling if you've been doing this long enough. Anything on his chart? I asked. because if you know the patient, you can guess which corner of the problem to start with. Says chronic alcohol use, previous lacerations, the usual, Barrett answered. No current meds listed, no allergies. Dr. Meehan stepped in like she always did, small, assertive, making decisions the way you push a stubborn screw. She put a hand on his shoulder and asked his name in this flat, disarming tone we use to get people to talk to us. Artie blinked and answered, voice rough. He tried to sit up and doubled over in pain. He started vomiting again, and this time the vomit had a grayish sheen, not like ordinary blood and bile, but like something else. We moved to the assessment room. We did what triage drills teach you: secure airway, breathing, circulation, set up an IV, get 2 lines if we can, give fluids, get basic labs, abdominal imaging. We slid the ultrasound probe across his belly and saw thickened loops of bowel where there should have been a more homogeneous field. Something was moving against the wall. Not good, Dr. Meehan said quietly. She asked Artie about pain, onset, anything he'd eaten, travel. He mentioned a night of drinking and a dumpster behind a pub. He laughed too high once when asked if he'd felt feverish. I took his temperature, and there it was. Borderline fever, but his skin was shot cold. You always notice those small contradictions, the body trying to be 2 things at once. We gave IV fluid, morphine, because you can't reason with intestines in misery, and broad-spectrum antibiotics until we had better data. We sent blood to the lab. Julian wheeled the portable X-ray. The overhead light hummed. I remember thinking I should call for a surgical consult, or maybe the administrator should be notified, because the clinic's list of problems that escalated like this tended to have a way of reading as municipal nightmares. But in the basement, the world outside counted on you to buy time. Then he vomited again, and this time he made a sound that was not a human sound, low, wet, like a machine misfiring, and the vomit had movement. It was a thin, wriggling thing at first, like a pale noodle that couldn't be alive, and then there were more, not visible in photographs, and not in the way textbooks described parasites, but solid and real, slick and cold on the basin. For a horrible beat of a second, my brain tried to catalog them the way I'd cataloged other things in my years, nematode-like, segments, pale, about the size of my finger. They were slippery. They had a smell like boiling cornmeal and iron, and something rotten underneath. I have a medical vocabulary for these things: helminths, larval stages, eggs, and I know how people try to distance themselves from what is happening by using terms like parasite instead of calling it out.
It doesn't change the fact that a thing just slid out of a man's mouth and made a sound against stainless steel that didn't belong to any part of the human body. Dr. Meehan moved with a steadiness that always unnerved me. Code Lyme, she said, and 3 syllables across the room felt like a door locking. Code Lyme is the phrase you never want to hear in Ward 5. In our little lexicon, it meant a confirmed internal infestation with potential for rapid spread. It triggered protocols we had trained for in whispers: immediate isolation, full PPE, the sealing of doors, and notification of the crematorium and administrator liaisons. Ward 5 went from being a place of measured calm to a place of lockdown almost before the rest of us realized. We sealed his room. The guard on the corridor closed the glass door and then slapped on a metal bar that made the sound of finality when it clicked. Sasha started the PPE checklist out loud like a prayer: respirator, face shield, hood, double gloves. We donned the suits in a practiced frenzy. The latex smells like a million surgeries. The hoods muffled our breathing, the lights were too sharp, and the suits made every movement clumsy. We looked ridiculous and invincible and fragile in the same second. Samples, Dr. Meehan said. Cultures, stool, blood, egg plates. Get the centrifuge running. Notify the administrator. She said the last part as if the hospital bureaucracy would react like a human being, which usually it did not. The Imperium calls upward are slow and handled by people who count bodies and margins. But we made the call anyway. Let the paper trail exist if anything else failed. We did the tests you do with a body that might have a helminth: microscopy, wet mount, KOH prep, and cross-reference with our Fey parasite database. There are parasites that affect certain species of their physiology, and ours were documented in occasional internal reports: gutworm incubations that could be short and violent, eggs that were tiny and sticky, larvae that hatched quickly in warm, PI-filled environments. The rules about gutworms, incubation time, contagion via eggs, and in some cases sexual contact, and rapid fatality without intervention were in the handbook. We did not have a miracle. We had protocol. Artie's stomach distended like a balloon with ink inside. He was feverish between episodes of cold sweats. He kept whispering apologies to us like promises that didn't need our answer. He asked about a dog that didn't exist. We gave him morphine, meperidine where necessary, and antiemetics, and we discussed anti-helminthic therapy, but every staff member at the table knew the constraints. The gutworm in question had a frighteningly fast life cycle when it found the right host. It could hatch and lay eggs quickly. It liked warm, moist tissues and did not play by the rules of our standard antiparasitic regimens.
Anthelminthics bought time for some hosts. For others, they were the prelude to new forms of suffering. We held a small conference in the doorway. Options were palliative measures, containment,
And the most hated word on the table, cremation as containment if the vermin could not be contained. The code Lime announcement sent a ripple through the basement. Down the corridor, a wall speaker crackled, and the fluorescent bulbs hummed at a pitch that set my teeth on edge. Over the next hour, it became clear this was not a one-off. The monitors in Ward 5 pinged, and people who had come in for stitches, for transplants, for illegal detoxes started showing similar early signs. Someone with a Gorgon-like presentation complained of stones in the intestines. A vampire in recovery who'd been here for a surgical dressing change looked pale in a way vampires don't normally look. It was as if the thing had a way to spread that ignored species line when it had reason to. I remember the way Dr. Meehan's face did not change. She methodically assigned rooms, ordered more PPE, asked for oxygen tanks to be readied, and advised that we open a crematorium on standby. She talked about the crematorium with business-like distance, like explaining a procedure, but you could hear the tremor in her voice if you listened for it. The crematorium was a contingency we hardly used. The thought that night felt obscene. We all know what using it means. 48 hours, she said at some point, while we moved to our routines. 48-hour quarantine, lockdown, no transfer unless administrator approves. 48 hours is a number that gives you rules for a short period, an incubation window, a timeline to see if someone stabilizes or collapses. No one in their right mind planned to live forever inside a number, but it gives you structure. I thought of Sasha standing outside the PPE station, tugging gloves on like it was theatrics, trying to steady her hands. She told me later she had a kid who wanted to know if she'd be home for soccer practice on Saturday morning. I don't think she was joking. We were all trying to find a future clause we could believe in. The first night grew teeth. Code line calls multiplied through the infracom. The generator coughed and took over the backup systems, and an elevator that had answered me twice that month stuck again in the shaft between floors. That old maintenance elevator has a manifesto of its own. You push the button and it chooses when to respond. It chose not to that night. At 2 in the morning, one of the guards knocked his coffee over and cursed loud enough to wake the dead. He'd been on the corridor for hours, watching a door and trying not to imagine what was happening behind it. He'd been one of those guys who believed in rules, and suddenly those rules were less like a manual and more like a prayer recited in hopes the world would be kinder if you said it out loud. We worked in knots that night.
IV poles were everywhere. The sterilization console hissed like a beast that ate fabric. You slide contaminated materials into a chamber, set the cycle, and watch the gauge move. Steam is a good killer for a lot of things. Steam and heat wreck eggs and larvae in closed environments, but anything inside a human body is beyond that easy fix. The console made us feel purposeful, though. You put a tray of soiled gowns in, you close the lid, you hit start, and the machine hummed like you'd done something right. The thing about a basement clinic is that its imperfections become your scaffolding. The lights flickered, the sprinkler system was on an old valve that complained if you used it, the doors had an institutional hollow sound. The dirt in the corners had a history. You worked around it because the people inside the walls mattered more than architectural dignity. It's harder to maintain that moral calculus over days. We opened an extra cold room out back, the one no courier ever wanted to enter. We began moving bodies when we had them, stacking properly labeled bags in refrigeration while the crematorium stood ready like some terrible promise on the edge of the campus. When someone dies under Code Lime, the process is different. Paperwork becomes ritual, and ritual becomes a way to stop yourself thinking about smell and heat, and the way a person is no longer a person but evidence. A small flash of culturally dark humor came from Barrett at 3 in the morning, deadpan. We're going to need more coffee and maybe a priest. No one laughed. Laughter is its own sign of health in these places, and it had been squeezed out of the room like air. Artie was getting worse. His abdomen felt like a drum. He made small comments about the ceiling tiles. He called my name and asked a question about whether the dog I'd had as a kid had liked the taste of my shoes. You learn to answer small questions because they tether a person to their mind. You are not allowed to get invested in those anchors because they hurt when they snap, and they snap often in our work. Then the first official transfer request arrived from outside the Imperium chain. A municipal hospital had called to say they had 3 patients with similar symptoms and were requesting support. We had protocols for interfacility transmission and transfer. The administrator's office responded with a terse message: do not transfer, contain, contact the crematorium if necessary. The message came with the coldness of bureaucracy. We will handle legal risk, you handle the clinical reality. There is something about being told to stop moving bodies that makes you feel like a clerk sorting paperwork for an inevitability. It felt like a verdict in an absent room, one that had been made by committees that never saw worms. I want to pause here and tell you about the smell.
You think you know what people smell like when they're nearly dead,
But until you stand in a room where something biological is breaking down on a scale you didn't agree to, the vocabulary fails. There is the metallic tang of blood, the sourness of bile, and then a wet, almost peppery smell when those worms die or get macerated. It's not pretty. You learn to breathe shallow. You learn to fold smell around you like a cloak. By dawn, the speaker system had gone from single alerts to constant interruptions. We used the word cascade after a while because it felt like something falling down that kept making noise. Ward 5's doors were shut. Guards rotated in and out. No one went home. The maintenance elevator stubbornly refused to take any of us up. You begin to measure time in small rituals when everyone you know is contained behind a line of doors. We had our moments of human smallness in the middle of that engineered hell. Sasha made tea that tasted like burnt cardboard and handed it to Dr. Meehan with a forced smile. Dr. Meehan stared into the cup like she was trying to read something important in the staining. Samara smoked a cigarette in the staff room and told us a story about the time she'd messed up a surgical knot and the surgeon had saved her with sarcasm. We tried to keep normal talk, because normal talk keeps your brain on the ground floor and not slithering into questions about whether this could have been stopped a week earlier. Artie kept hollering at one point and then went quiet. His oxygen saturation dropped and we increased flow. His abdomen went tight, and then, like a bad dream with a cruel punchline, there was movement beneath the skin that you could see, a rippling that the ultrasound picked up clearer than the eye. I remember thinking, absurdly, that we were watching an organism learning the contours of another organism as onlookers at a strange, intimate theater. At some point, Julian said, in a voice that sounded hollow to me, "We need to start documenting for mortalities." The crudity of the phrase almost made me laugh. Mortalities. But the paperwork is how the Imperium keeps records, and it is how they decide what will be accessible many months later when people in suits want answers. We began filling out forms. We wrote timed entries in charts, and we logged who touched what linens. It felt like being a clerk who was also a witness to a bad accident in slow motion. By the time the sun tried to push its way through a narrow basement window somewhere over the boundary of the clinic, we had 3 more code lime suspects. The alarms were like an insect chorus I couldn't switch off. I was exhausted in the ways one only notices when the adrenaline runs out. Your hands shake, your coordination frays, and your capacity to feel compassion at the minute-to-minute level thins. You protect yourself by turning empathy into procedures. You do because you have to.
When a patient tries to pull at tubes or becomes violent, the older rule we all learned applies. Call security. Don't try to physically restrain a person if there's a biological hazard you don't fully know. We called security 3 times that morning, and they arrived with the practiced face of people who expect the worst and would rather be surprised by anything else. Guards in the basement are more than shoulders. They carry protocols and keys. Keys mean mobility in a place where mobility is rationed. I should say now that when the first body was moved toward the crematorium that day, no one felt relief. There was nothing almost spiritual about it, only a mechanical closure. Men in respirators wheeled the cart, and the crematorium door, which we'd kept sealed like a terrible toy, opened with a pneumatic shutter. You do what you can with the tools you are given, and in a world that runs on secrecy and liability, the societal answer to contagion is often heat and paperwork and the careful sealing of things that smell. We were not yet at the point of mass sterilization, not yet, but the thought of it hovered like a weather front above us. You could feel the pressure change. Dr. Meehan kept asking for updates on supplies and on an administrative decision that wasn't forthcoming. She kept her chin up and her hands in the work, which is the sort of thing that makes people think she would be fine in any crisis. The truth is that leaders show their cracks by continuing the work anyway. You notice the cracks because you're the one holding the map. Around the midpoint of that long, merciless day, we had to make a choice about where to concentrate our resources. The basement clinic was a secret because secrecy let us help people who would otherwise be shoved into headlines and cages. But secrecy cuts both ways. It can become a coffin if you treat it like one. We talked about transfers, about the idea of isolating individuals versus focusing on triage and palliative care. The Imperium's fingers remained distant. The administrator's assistant sent a message that was more legal than human: contain and report. Somewhere in the middle of doing the only thing that made sense, treating the patient in front of you, you learn that human beings are both fragile and stubborn. You watch Artie's eyes roll as he whispers something about a dog, and you want to help him in ways that medicine doesn't allow. You stand in the corridor and you listen to monitors beep, smell disinfectant, and realize the abandoned hospital basement we worked in could be a metaphor for a society that keeps its ugly parts out of sight. Then you realize the ugly parts crawl very efficiently when they feel safe.
I am telling you all of this as it was happening, with hands that trembled then and tremble now when the memory comes back. We did not know how bad it would become. We did not know how fast it would learn to move between bodies.
We only knew the rules, the smells, the people, and the fact that beneath the abandoned surface, the building kept a machine that made decisions for us, a steam sterilizer that hissed, a crematorium that could be warmed, a guard who could lock a door. For now, that felt like enough. The doors stayed closed. The alarms kept spitting out code Lyme notices. The maintenance elevator finally coughed and took a body up, and when the doors opened above ground, there was a flicker of midday sun that looked incongruous and brutal to my tired eyes. The basement held its breath like a mouth before a scream. That's where we were when the second wave of calls came in, and the administrator's office asked for a status update. I told them, as accurately as the chaos allowed, that we were containing, that we had instituted 48-hour quarantine, that we had a confirmed infestation of a gutworm variant, and we were testing for eggs. I told them Artie was stable enough to be watched, but unstable enough to know he could decline. They didn't instruct anything more meaningful than to keep documenting. Paperwork is a kind of lifeline, in a bureaucratic way. It doesn't save lives, but it preserves them on paper, and sometimes that is all the world has left for the living. We kept moving because the basement demanded motion. We trimmed down choices into small, serviceable actions: monitor, replace fluids, record, seal. Outside, the hospital looked like an empty building that could be demolished with a week's notice. Down here, people breathed and vomited and told jokes that sounded ragged. Inside a place that had once been abandoned, the mechanical systems kept running, and within those systems, life and death kept their complicated, awful dance. The basement held its breath, and then it exhaled with a new sound: a page of the intercom, a clatter of trays, the furious whisper of people trying to be professional while their hands betrayed them with little tremors. We were running on a rhythm made of adrenaline and the dull grief of things you cannot save. I could feel its shape in my shoulders and in the way my jaw ached from clenching. I'll pull back and tell you something small before I go all the places you'd rather not go. In the days before the outbreak, we had rituals that felt indulgent only because they were human. Sasha would tuck the photo of her kid back behind the locker door and close it like a promise. Barrett had a playlist that he would play low where the speakers worked, music that belonged to the decade when none of us had decided our life would end up in a basement. Samara kept a ridiculous keychain on her scrub string, and enamel dachshund that jingled whenever she moved. You learn to see these small things in other people, because when the world strips down, trivial attachments are what make you remember that this job is done for people, not for forms. The small, ordinary things kept turning until the night the bathroom door bled black.
Content warning. The next section contains explicit gore and body horror detail. If you're sensitive to descriptions of disembowelment, parasitic emergence, and traumatic death, consider skipping ahead. Samara had gone to the staff bathroom after a long stretch at intake. She'd been joking about coffee and soccer practice, and then she was not joking at all. She texted Sasha a quick line, "I need a minute," and ducked into the fluorescent-lit stall. There was a dull hum of ventilation, the smell of hand soap, and the olfactory ghosts of 2-minute tired people. A minute passed, and then nothing, which is the kind of silence that makes your mouth go dry. Sasha went to check, concerned and irritated in equal measure, and opened the door to a scene that still feels like wet cement in my head. Samara was crouched on the floor, hands braced on her knees, eyes rolled up like someone who'd looked too hard into the sun. She was muttering something that made no sense. The moment Sasha pulled her into the light, there was a motion in the doorway, and movement that didn't belong to human anatomy. A pale, slick thing escaping from behind Samara's belly button, sliding across the tile like it had invented shame. You know, there are times when your brain says, this is a hallucination, this is a test, this is not real. Our training gives us categories to hold on to: parasite, extrusion, rupture, but nothing prepares you for watching a human being reduce into something you can lay in a tray. Samara's face folded and unfurled like rag paper. She screamed. No, that's wrong. She made a sound that was equal parts animal and regret. The worms were there in a squeezing, writhing score, some small, thin things that slithered like threads, others fat and segmented, almost muscular. They knew how to find light. Sasha yelled. I don't remember entirely who hit the intercom or who screamed for PPE. I remember only the cadence: move, barrier, dawn, seal. 2 guards barreled in, docs followed, and we sealed the bathroom like a crime scene. We collected what we could into specimen jars: wet mounts, slides, anything microscopic. And someone started the disinfectant fogger like it was a call-and-answer hymn. Sterilization consoles clamored. But in the middle of it, Samara convulsed, and the worms leapt in a way that felt profane. They left mid-air to find new surfaces, new cracks in latex gloves, new skin. Moments like that bend the rules. We had been taught the biology, how eggs cling, how larvae can find mucous membranes or open wounds.
You read it and it's an abstraction, but the reality of it is more like watching a living thing seek purchase in a dark world and knowing how much warmer the human body is than masonry. A worm does not care about dignity, it cares about temperature and a place to lay. Dr. Leroy was a good man in the blunt way that doctors are, practical, not sentimental, a cigarette in the night and a gentle hand in the ER.
He'd rushed into the bathroom because Samara had been his friend on shift. He was the one who got slimed. I remember the look on his face, equal parts resignation and pure disbelief, when he touched his gloved hand to his throat and felt a squirm. He went gray where he'd been ruddy. They took him immediately to isolation. He was coughing and then coughing blood. We watched him with a helplessness that punches you flat. We tried immediate decontamination, remove suits, bag them, shower him with antiseptic, but the eggs are insidious. In Leroy's throat we saw the beginnings, small nodules under the mucosa that, to an untrained eye, look like blisters. To us they looked like the outline of future betrayers. We started him on broad anthelmintics, but by then the worm's cycle was already racing. You are always racing the life cycle, and in this strain the life cycle seemed determined to win. Leroy's infection complicated everything. He was one of ours. Watching a colleague decline is unlike watching a stranger. We assigned 2 people to him for the first day, then 3, then none, because managing him meant everyone else had 2 fewer hands. He was lucid enough to smoke long, bitter jokes in between coughs. He made us promise to look after Samara. He looked at me once and said in a voice I will never unhear, "If it gets in deep, Jamie, be merciful." He said it like a surgical instruction. He did not mean it as a request for his own death necessarily. He meant it as a warning about the choices this thing would force on us. If you have ever moved through a hospital in normal times, even in a night shift lull, you know the corridors have their own pulse, the squeak of a cart, the click of an ID badge. That rhythm started to stutter. People took to carrying keycards like they were talismans. The keycard, small, laminated, a token with a chip, represented mobility. In a system that can shut you down with a single locked door, mobility becomes worth more than a dozen paychecks, and in the dark, someone will always be tempted to take what gives them freedom. It was Marston who tried it first, not because he was cruel, because Marston was afraid. He had a wife who lived 5 towns over and a little kid who drew suns at breakfast. He told me later, in a whisper in a transfer office, that he couldn't stand the thought of doors closing on him. He slipped Dr. Meehan's keycard from her lanyard during a moment when she was giving instructions to someone at the console. I still see the way his hand shook when he thumbed the cart. He moved toward the elevator like a man going home on Christmas Eve. The problems with stealing a keycard are not just moral. The point of those cards is audit trails. Every time someone uses it, the system logs them. It also triggers security protocols that look for unauthorized movement. It pinged the administrator's office that someone had used a staff card in an unusual pattern. Marston was stopped at the elevator by a guard who recognized him, and in a quieter corridor, the guard said to him what the rest of us had been thinking, "You can't leave." He tried to run from us, and the guard got hurt in the scramble. No one meant for an ankle to break. People meant for survival. You can understand it without excusing it. Word spread like a second contagion. If Marston was desperate, other people became either braver or holier in their selfishness. Croft packed his bag and disappeared into a supply corridor. Julian tried to make it as if he'd been reassigned by the administrator. Barrett started hiding charts. We found out later that Marston had left the keycard in an attempt to get his family out via a maintenance route. He never made it. Desperation does strange things to reasoning. At one point we had to seal the doors with more than just guards. Dr. Meehan arranged for physical barricades and had the lock codes updated, but it was a losing battle. People's heads get small when they are trapped. The thing we were trying to contain did not care if you were an orderly or an administrator. It found tissue of all kinds appealing. The heat of our panic probably helped it. Or at least that's the thing you tell yourself to sleep. It's necessary to explain what the crematorium meant practically to us. The on-site crematorium is a facility with paperwork and a furnace. It is kept for specific legal and ethical reasons. Controlling contagions is one of them. We used it because external transfer would risk the public, because the Imperium's legal counsel said burning the bodies kept the spores from spreading, because the worm eggs are vulnerable to heat and sustained high temperatures. The idea of burning your colleagues sits like a stone in your mouth. We cycled bodies through it, sometimes wrapped, sometimes in bags, always labeled with an incineration order. The ritual was clinical to keep us from being human in the process, but ritual does not blunt the grief. At some point, the bottom fell out of the bucket we were all carrying. The infection rate rose, the equipment started failing, oxygen concentrators overtaxed, backups popping like bubble wrap, and resources became a tapering list. The Imperium was slow. The administrator's messages got briefer, then sparser. People who were meant to be liaison points became distant names in the intercom. The basement became a nest for improvised decision-making and moral triage. You can pretend triage is a medical concept, but it's also a moral one. When beds are finite and contagion is exponential, triage ceases to be about who can be saved and becomes about who we will try to save. We began keeping a list. The list had columns: name, species, likelihood, contagion status.
It is evidence enough to make your hands steady and your heart small. We moved people into palliative cots with morphine drips, and others into isolation with restraints, with a desperate mercy that felt like betrayal.
We were choosing, and every choice felt like cutting out a part of ourselves. Dr. Meehan kept a notebook with a list of everyone she'd tried to save. It was a small, battered thing with corners stained from her constant, ungloved handling. At times, when she could seize a minute, she forgot the world around her and wrote names into it like penance or prayer. She was not religious in an obvious way, not the way Samara joked about priests, but she believed in the ledger of care. The ledger was how she remembered that people were not abstractions. One afternoon, if days can be named by anything beyond the beep of the monitors, Dr. Meehan called me into her office. The office was a narrow room with a small window looking out into a shaft of maintenance pipes. The light there was a mean greenish wash. She was tired in a new way, the kind of weariness that sits behind the eyes and shapes words into something that says, "This is what I have left." She told me she felt unwell. It was not dramatic at first. A rash in a place, reduced appetite, a hardness in the belly where a doctor always feels. She smiled at me, a sad sort of curve, and said, "Jamie, I've been through things. I can tell when the thing has taken root." She asked about her options, and because we had lived with the rules, she also asked for something else. If it becomes impossible to manage, I want the option of dying on my terms. Do you understand what I mean? Those conversations are slippery. There's a legal scaffolding around assisted death that varies by jurisdiction in the real world. But our clinic was a gray place where policy and ethics got wrapped in the same blanket and thrown against a door that refused to keep the cold out. I have never suggested anything like it in training. I had never been asked to provide that kind of mercy. Her request sat in the air like steam. To deny it felt inhuman. To grant it felt like taking a scalpel to a living person. I understood it as the shape of a leader's last command. Make the hard choice, but do not let me be a spectacle. We talked through medications and protocols like we were assembling a bouquet for an execution. I asked about the moral weight. She told me that she had seen contagion eat people and turn them into something else, and that she wanted a way to look back and know she had provided a choice for herself. She did not ask me to kill her. She asked me to provide a measure of control in a scenario where control had been ripped from us. I will not paraphrase the more technical side of what she asked. It's unnecessary to the point of being dangerous. What I will say is this. She handed me her keycard that day. She gave it to me and said, with a small, cracked smile, "If I go, Jamie, you should know how to lock this place down." The gesture was practical and human and terrible. A day later, Dr. Meehan's condition worsened. Her examination showed nodules consistent with deep infestation.
Her mouth had the metallic chrome smile of someone on the edge of shock. She stopped sleeping for more than a nibble each shift. The person who had been all logic and action began to slow, and those of us left had to watch the empire of her competence crumble. She kept directing us, though, like a conductor who hadn't yet decided to put down the baton. There was an event that we talk about less because language flattens it into the clinical, and because it's the kind of thing you would prefer to forget. One night, a small faction of the staff snapped. It started as a rumor. The administrator approved cremations for anyone who presents black, someone said. Rumors change situations like we chisel marble. People gathered around the crematorium doors with a kind of resigned righteousness. That's when the staff mutinied. Some of the porters refused to move infected patients. Some of the nurses tried to block the crematorium doors. A fight broke out. Shoved trays, a bottle of hand sanitizer flung like a Molotov, and someone got a headbutt in and bled onto the tiled floor. We called security. They arrived in waves. In the middle of the chaos, a guard with a badge I recognized told us bluntly that we had to carry the infected to the furnace or be complicit in a larger breach. That was the language corporate uses when they have to pressure people. You either comply or become the cause of something larger. It is a poison. In the chaos, someone, no one remembers who first, dragged Leroy out with a sheet over his head. He was conscious enough to understand being moved. He looked at me once when they pushed him onto the trolley and said, "Jamie, remember the dog." He meant Artie's dog. A meaningless human punctuation in a life that had less and less punctuation left. We took him to the crematorium like you might take a failing machine to a scrapyard. There are no adequate words for watching someone being made into a file on a computer and then heat and flame. I want to be clear. We did what the Imperium advised, in part because they held the purse strings and the legal exposure, and in part because the biology of this gutworm suggested that incineration was the most reliable way to stop eggs from hatching and spreading through the air and the plumbing. It worked on surfaces and on the bodies that had already left the equation. It did not work on what was already inside a living human.
By now, the casualties were multiplying in ways that kept folding in on themselves. Ward 5's alarms were like a living organism. One ending, another beginning, the sound never let up. We started to use the sterilization console more than ever. Gowns, equipment, surgical tools, mattresses. Sterilization cycles became a part of our prayers. The sterilizer is a small room with a hatch. You load contaminated linen in, set the cycle, and the machine subjects the contents to sustained high-temperature steam. It is reliable for inanimate vectors. It is no use for what's inside people.
The decision to mass sterilize the whole basement did not come from a single person. It was an ugly, collaborative, exhausted consensus built of fear and partial solutions. It also came with a terrible calculus. You can sterilize the environment and slow egg spread, but what about the infected inside? We debated sealing the HVAC, burning the ducts, removing the hospital's access to outside vents. Legal counsel suggested we scavenge records and document everything. The administrator's voice over the intercom that night was thin and distant. Proceed with sterilization protocols. Avoid external contamination at all costs. Keep paper records. We executed an environmental strike, full structure fogging with disinfectants approved for helminthic eggs, sealing certain vents and shutting off recirculation. That required us to evacuate sections of the basement by force and to move patients into dedicated quarantine pods. It was like moving furniture in a house as flames licked at one wall. You moved people and items, and you tried to find dignity in the act of lifting someone's arm, of tucking a blanket, of telling them you loved them before there was a reason to believe anyone could hear. There was a moment nearing the end of the second day where I found myself alone in the recovery bay, sweating through my PPE, and I just looked at the keycard in my hand, Dr. Meehan's keycard she'd given to me earlier, and felt its plastic slick with disinfectant. I remember thinking how small a token looked against a backdrop that had become apocalyptic. The keycard opened doors, but it could not open tears. It could not unmake the smell of burnt hair that the crematorium produced, or the sound of a tray clanging in the sterilizer. Artie was a complicated presence throughout. He'd gone from vomiting to searing pain to a horrifying ease with the idea of his body betraying him. At one point, he whispered to me in a voice like gravel, "If I don't make it, tell the dog I loved him." He believed in his dog in a way that felt like faith. We tried every supportive measure, fluids, analgesia, antihelminthics, and surgical consultations. But as we all learned the worm's life cycle, there was less and less that we could do beyond palliation. Then something odd happened. As many of the others around him succumbed, Artie improved in small ways. He stabilized, then regained a color that was human rather than corpse. When we transferred some of the survivors up, it was Artie who got the nod to be moved to a longer-term quarantine facility under Imperium supervision. I watched him go, the straps tight, his hands gripping nothing like success and everything like luck. We lost people who mattered. Samara's absence hollowed out the staff room. No one touched her enamel dachshund keychain for weeks. Leroy was gone. Dr. Meehan made the choice she had discussed with me. Terminal nodules, no feasible reversal. She asked me to give her something so she wouldn't go through the indignities of the last stages. The decision to honor her request, I want to stress this again, was not made lightly. It was made in a room with 2 doctors and 2 nurses, and an ethics that had been softened by exhaustion, and a reality that offered too few choices. She died with a hand in mine, and a note tucked into her notebook that read, simply, "Do better for them." You may want to know the legal language we used. I will not provide it. Legalities are for forms. What I can say is that her death was recorded with the same clinical precision as the others. Time, cause, notes. The crematorium did the rest. It was a human thing, a leader choosing a private end. But it is also emblematic of what this outbreak did to us. It turned private grief into a matter of institutional policy. At some deranged, compulsory point, the Imperium decided to go broader. A full structure sterilization would be attempted that required us to evacuate all non-critical staff and to sacrifice some access to make sure there was no environmental reservoir left. That meant a mass burning of disposables, a sealing of vents, and a sterilization schedule that would keep the place closed for days. The administrator's directive was blunt: sterilize at scale, limit transfer, preserve evidence. We enacted it over a long, gray night. The sterilization team, external to our floor, but working with ghosts of our staff, brought in massive foggers and heat units. They sealed doors with adhesive and ran monitors. For days after, the basement smelled like disinfectant, like a hospital that had tried to bleach away memory. The sterilization didn't wipe away guilt. We walked through the fogged halls like people moving through altered states. Air heavy, eyes gritty, and the hum of machines a low, brotherly roar. When the quiescence finally came, that strange truce where alarms do not ring, and you begin to imagine the possibility of normal life again, the counts were terrible. I am not a numbers man in the way administration might prefer, but the tally that came down the pipeline was that dozens were dead, scores infected, and only a small fraction of staff emerged without some sort of damage. The Imperium marked the event, closed it like a file, and promised an internal review.
Promises are sometimes the only rituals left that people with power perform. They are also, often, thin comforts. Artie was moved off the site under heavy escort. He survived. That is the small, absurd consolation stitched into the whole mess. A werewolf who loved cheap whiskey and once had a dog lived. He went somewhere with monitored care, and in the months after the basement was sealed, I sometimes imagine him in a room that smelled not of disinfectant, but of wet earth and grass. Maybe he remembers us. Maybe he doesn't. Survival leaves as much residue as death. Sasha and I asked to be transferred. I requested anything that would get me away from the basement and the smell of steam and the echo of Morrison's rising in my ears. The transfer was cruelly simple. Fill out the form, wait in the holding bay among boxes and people who had been both frantic and heroic. We were given an administrative nod and the chance to leave the place we had tried to keep secret. We left with our bags and the weight of others in our eyes. On the drive away in the dim, I remember the way the streetlights slid by and felt like small, watchful moons. If you ask me what I felt afterwards, I will tell you about the nightmares. I will tell you about waking up convinced the basement doors were opening, and then realizing I was safe and cursing at my own body for being wrong. Nights are where the mind plays back decisions and sharpens them like knives. There are recurring images: Samara in the fluorescent stall, the worms clinging to tile, Leroy's hand on the trolley, Dr. Meehan's notebook. There is also the sound, the hissing of the sterilizer, the pneumatic thud of the crematorium, the thin, bureaucratic voice of the administrator telling us to keep records and to be sure to fill out forms. I started seeing a therapist. They call them different things: counselor, behavioral health specialist. The one I met took notes like a court reporter and sometimes offered a phrase to unstick me: survivor's guilt, complex PTSD. The acronyms are useful to file against but do not change the taste of memory. The notes in my file are short, clinical, and they keep me from inventing grander things for the record. I have them because the Imperium requires post-event monitoring for staff on the record. I do it because the therapist asked me to keep a journal. A typical journal entry would be: dreamed of worms, woke, smelled steam, shook. Another might be a more self-aware rumination: I keep thinking about the dog Artie mentioned. It feels like I should be embarrassed. It is not about the dog. It is about the fact that some small human thing survived, and why that hurts to hold. The therapist told me to name objects and to ground myself. To that I say, name the things that are human inside you and hold them like a talisman. I practiced saying aloud the names of colleagues who had died. It felt like a litany. There were administrative hearings, of course. A review committee came through with badges and clipboards and statements that read like apologies. They wanted to know whether we followed protocol. We did, sometimes to a breaking point. The committee, in its careful indifference, wrote recommendations. The Imperium covered legal angles. There were settlements and confidential agreements. The Imperium's name means the rumor mill will never stop. It also means the official story will be smoothed and revised in ways that make people who were there, who stood in the rooms where it happened, uncomfortable. Memory resists being sewn into clean narratives. Months later, when the basement was scrubbed and painted and reopened for a different kind of specialty use that made the wing look tidy to passers-by, I would walk by and notice the dust rings on the handrails and feel a tightening in my chest. People who walked those halls would never know about the nights we kept the heat on in the crematorium, or the smell that drifted from the sterilizer like a bad prayer. They would not know the names we kept whispering. They would see only a facade and maybe, if they were curious, the sign that said "No public access" and think the building was abandoned, when the truth was that it was very much used and very much bloody. You asked in the title to know what I saw in the basement. The answer is complicated. I saw a secret clinic with good intentions and a poor supply chain. I saw people who tried to be heroic
and people who tried to be human in awful circumstances. I saw worms that could do what science says they do: find host tissue, hatch quickly, spread in ways that outrun our best intentions. I saw rituals become necessary, and I saw ritual fail to soothe. I saw a leader ask for control over her dying, and I saw the staff make impossible choices. Mostly, I saw how fragile the thin membrane of civilization is when the thing on the other side of the wall wants in. If you want the cold clinical tally, here is as much as I will give without pretending numbers fix sorrow. Dozens of patients died, numerous staff were infected, a fraction survived, and a small group of us left carrying the weight of what we had done and what we had not. Artie survived and was transferred to Imperium long-term care. Samara, Leroy, and Dr. Meehan did not. The crematorium was used. The sterilizer did its job. The basement remained a place with an institutional history of secrets. People in authority issued statements. The Imperium conducted internal reviews and chose language carefully. It is what institutions do to keep the rawness of human suffering from spilling into public knowledge. There are images that never fade. Sometimes when I sit alone, I can still smell the steam and feel the weight of the keycard in my palm. I can hear the thin metallic ring of the crematorium and the sound of a worm flicking against stainless steel.
I have nightmares that open like doors to the old corridors, and I wake convinced I've left a tray in the sterilizer. I forget ordinary things, keys, phone numbers, but I can tell you with clarity the sound that an ICU ventilator makes when it is overloaded. The human cost is not only the dead, it is the choices we had to make, and the way those choices stack like boxes in a corner of your mind. If you believe in narrative justice, this story will frustrate you. There was not always a villain to punish. Sometimes the villain looked like a system that values secrecy over resources, or like an administrator whose distance allowed him to make decisions without smelling the room. Sometimes the villain looked like a worm. Sometimes the villain was the shape of panic in someone's face at 3 in the morning. If you came here hoping for a single moral, I will fail you. But if you want an honest accounting, here are the things I carry, and I want you to take them with you. Secret clinics exist because society tells uncomfortable populations to disappear. We put institutions underground and hope the problems won't resurface. When they do, the people who staff those places are asked to do impossible things. We made choices we thought were the least bad, and some of them were bad enough to haunt us. In the quiet after, there were small, bright things. Sasha's kid sent a drawing to the clinic via a courier. Simple, proud scribble of a sun with a little person under it and a thank you in unsteady block letters. Barrett started a small fund among former staff to plant a tree near the hospital's front drive. Julian donated a kidney stone of his own story to a podcast. He laughed about it. We didn't. Artie, when moved, wrote a short note in messy handwriting that someone folded into an envelope and addressed to no one. It read, "Tell them the dog was real." We laughed and cried and then went back to appointments. Now I work in a different place. It is less secret and more bureaucratic. There are ethics boards, mandatory counseling sessions, and an astonishing amount of paperwork. Sometimes people ask me about the basement. They say, "You worked in an abandoned hospital basement? What was it like?" I say what I always say. It is a place where people went to be private, and sometimes that privacy killed them. I tell them the small things too, about Samara's laugh, about Dr. Meehan's pen, about Sasha's photo, because those things are how we stay human. And the final, quiet truth, what I saw in the basement will stay with me. It plays out in the clatter of silverware, in the way I flinch when I smell steam, in the way I keep my own child's contact on speed dial, though I have no children. The basement changed me the way an infection changes an organ. You survive, and then you relearn function with a scar. If you've made it this far, thank you. You wanted the whole story. I gave it to you in as honest a voice as I could manage.
If you want more behind the scenes of what happened in places like that, more on the rules we had to follow, what the Imperium's role really meant, or any of the technical bits I left out, tell me. Hit subscribe, check the playlist for related breakdowns, and maybe, if it's helpful, share this with someone who understands why a quiet basement can hold a loud truth. There are nights when I still walk past that wing and press my palm to the cool glass, half expecting the maintenance elevator to cough and someone to hand me a chart and expect me to step back into my old life.
The glass is cold and unhelpful. The building looks, once again, like an ordinary functional thing. To most people, it probably looks abandoned. To me, it looks like a place that keeps secrets in its walls. It looks like the kind of place where once something crawled out of a human and changed everything below the fluorescent lights.